Is it possible to make a profit flower farming? Can we believe the claims? Can we buy into the hype? Let's find out. I've been very upfront and honest in the past about my personal profits. You can go back and watch How Much Money Do You Make Flower Farming, our video from last spring, if you want to learn more about the details and the ins and outs of expenses and all of those things. We're going to touch on some of those things today as well, but if you want to do my exact numbers, go and watch that video. I'll link it after this one. In the meantime, we're going to address some other claims. The first thing that you should know is that yes, you can always do something as a side hustle. And guys, I am all for more American grown flowers. The more cut flowers that are being grown here in the US, the better for everyone. The better availability there is for florists, the better availability for consumers, then the less likely we are to be buying our flowers imported from Colombia and Ecuador. So the more flower farmers here in the US, I think the better. But we do have to be realistic when we're telling people to become flower farmers, because there are lots of caveats to flower farming and making money flower farming. Of course, you can do anything as a side gig. I'm not here to tell you that you shouldn't do this or that you should do this. I'm just giving you the information. A side gig can be great. It can be a great option. Maybe you just want to take a few weddings a year and do that on the side. Maybe you just want to grow some for your friends. All totally fine to do as a side hustle. But if you are thinking about quitting a job, investing in becoming a flower farmer, or retiring and having flower farming be your plan for retirement, you're going to want to think about some of these things. The first one that I'm going to address is the claim I've been seeing about flower farmers can take the winter off and can still make $30,000 an acre. So this is the number that has been thrown out to me in several advertisements by a pretty well-known flower farmer who is selling courses. I find this claim to actually be pretty close now in terms of the revenue. Okay, so when we're talking about revenue per acre, $30,000 is not crazy by any means when we're talking about an acre of land. Now, of course, that is net, so gross might be more. So for example, if you look at my video where we discuss my earnings, my gross was actually $107,000, but my net was only a little over, I think, around $35,000. So pretty accurate, I find. But you do have to be hustling pretty hard to make that happen, because you have to be making sales. It's not just about growing the flowers, people. You gotta have a market, you have to have a sales outlet. So that claim, I would say, check, realistic. Now, the other claim that's being made is take the winters off as a flower farmer. Well, here it is, January 8th, and I am absolutely not taking the winter off. I have tons of seeds started already right now. This year I overwintered our dahlias, but typically I would be digging dahlias, I would be dividing dahlias, I would be checking on dahlias, making sure that they're still alive in storage. I would be ordering seeds, making field plans, and the biggest one that I do in the off season is my marketing, my business planning, and all of that stuff, right? Taxes, paperwork, all of these things still go along with farming. It's not like you're just out there in the garden. If this is a business, it's still a business. You have to figure out where I'm going to be selling in the coming year. Am I going to be doing any farmers markets? Am I going to do a farm stand, making pre-sales, doing CSA sales, figuring out all the sales taxes? So I would say that the claim of being able to take winters off as a flower farmer is pretty false. And I would say anyone in ag would tell you the same thing, that farmers, even though maybe your crops aren't actually physically producing in the wintertime, we're still working during that time. So I would say this claim, false. Now, that being said, the workshops that are being sold by the person who's making those claims are really, really well known, very great, very reputable courses. So don't let it turn you off. If you want to take a flower farming course to help you learn how to grow flowers, or if you want to do it as a side hustle, or if you really do want to take the risk and jump in, go for it. That's a very good course to take, but be wary when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to be able to take 4 months off out of the year every winter where I'm not doing anything. That's just not reality. The next video that I've seen a lot is a claim that you can grow peonies and only work 1 month out of the year and earn $240,000. Man, if that were true, let me tell you. All right, so here's where that claim comes from. They are saying that by growing 4,000 peony roots and harvesting 15 stems per peony plant and selling those stems at $4 a stem, that is equaling $240,000. On the surface, this all sounds awesome, and I'm only having to work 1 month out of the year because peonies have a short harvest window. If doubt is already starting to creep in and you're thinking, this sounds really overly rosy, maybe someone's trying to sell me something, ding ding, you are correct. Okay, someone is trying to sell you a course, someone's trying to sell you some peony roots, someone's trying to sell you something. So let's talk about the real numbers, because growing peonies can be a very fun thing to do. If you want to, again, side hustle, if you want to grow some peonies, harvest those peonies, sell some bunches every year, definitely. But we're going to talk about doing it on the scale that we're talking about and whether you can actually make that kind of money. So there's obvious downsides of growing 4,000 peonies. The number one is it's a monoculture. If you're growing 4,000 peonies in an acre as recommended, then you are probably looking at a pretty heavy monoculture system. You're going to start running into things like funguses, especially things like botrytis and powdery mildew are really common in peonies, especially when they are packed in tightly together like you would need to do if you're trying to do this in an acre. So monocultures are always bad when we're talking about farming, right? Flower farming is no exception to this. So that's a pretty obvious downside. We're going to talk some more about costs here in a second, but let's talk about whether 15 stems per peony is a realistic number. Now, I would say yes, 15 stems per peony at maturity is a realistic number. Key phrase being at maturity. Usually when we're buying peony roots, especially wholesale peony roots, which are going to be much less expensive than buying retail peony roots, which usually run around $40 a pop. If we're buying wholesale, usually they're closer to $10 each. We'll talk about that in a second. Most of those are going to be a 3 to 5 eye. That means you're going to be looking at 3 years where you don't want to harvest any of your peonies off of those plants. That's because you want those plants to be putting all their energy down into the tuber, into the roots, starting a nice strong plant, because then in year 4, you're going to be rewarded with a lot of flowers. So years 1, 2, and 3, you are disbudding every single peony off of that plant, every single one. There are people who will tell you you can harvest them. Yes, you can. Of course, they're your plants. You can do whatever you want, but best practice is to not do it, because that's going to give you a stronger and healthier peony plant in year 4. It is worth it. I promise you. If you do harvest them, you weaken the plant significantly, especially in those first developmental years. And while weakening them isn't always a huge deal, it makes them more prone to things like disease. It just makes them higher maintenance. And then again, in year 4, you're not going to be rewarded with as many flowers. And over time, those flowers can actually start to decline. The same is true if you harvest more than a third of your flowers from your peony plants every year. So you want to harvest no more than a third every year. The remaining 2/3 of those peonies you should be disbudding. That means you're removing the flowers, because that's going to help, again, put the energy into the roots of the peonies and help keep them healthy if this is a long-term investment for you. People always ask me, well, I don't do this with my home peonies. I let them all bloom and they're fine. That's because you're not harvesting from them. If you're harvesting from your peonies, you're cutting a lot off of that stem. The stem that you're cutting for a cut peony is going to be about this long. In order to bunch it, have it in a bucket, it's got to be pretty long. That means there's taking off substantial amounts of foliage from that plant. Peonies are one that need that foliage. All summer long, they're using that foliage to put energy down into their roots for the next spring's bloom. So if you remove all of that foliage, it's going to really weaken the plant. So when we're harvesting, even if we're only harvesting a third of the flowers, we want to disbud the remaining 2/3, because we're trying to save the plant some energy, because we're taking off a third of the foliage. So by disbudding the flowers, we're saving the plant quite a bit of energy in that flower and seed production, instead of having it bloom and it wastes more energy doing that. So again, this is just best practices when we're talking about growing peonies. So if we look at this in a business construct, the first 3 years, we have only expenses. We'll get to expenses in a second. Only expenses, no revenue. Starting in year 4, you can start to harvest your peonies, but you're still having to do the work of disbudding the rest of them, and you can still only harvest about a third per plant. So it's really not all that many, maybe 4 stems per plant. You're not going to reach full maturity on your peonies where you're harvesting 15 stems per plant, probably for 10 years after planting your 3 to 5 eye peony. And that's if everything goes well. If your plants don't get hailed on, for example, a big hailstorm will really knock them back. Late freezes, temperature swings, all kinds of things can set you back with peonies. So again, I'd say at least 10 years until you're harvesting that 15 stems per plant number. So now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about the feasibility of actually harvesting those stems. So let's say that you've gotten to year 10, you finally have your peonies producing about 50 stems per plant, and you're harvesting 15-ish or so that are sellable. How much time is that going to take? So it's likely that with 4,000 plants, you're going to need to hire staff to help you harvest, because peonies are a trickier diva, okay, when it comes to harvest window, because when we are harvesting our peonies, we don't want them to be these tight balls, right? We want them to be what's called marshmallow stage. So that means they are fluffy like a marshmallow, but still closed. The window where they're at that perfect stage is pretty narrow. We're talking maybe 3 days. So while we can stagger our harvest by planting early, mid, and late blooming peonies, so we're kind of staggering our harvest, it is still not 100% realistic to say that we're going to be able to harvest all 15 of those stems per plant in the right amount of time, in the proper harvest stage, in a timely manner, because we're working with a very limited time window for proper harvest. If we were talking about a full month of harvest for all the peonies, that's a different thing. So again, your best bet if you want to do this, make sure you're going with a mix of early, mid, and late blooming peonies. So again, if you want to make sure you get them all harvested, you're going to probably need to hire help, because it's going to take at least 10 seconds per stem to harvest, because we have to clip, we have to strip the leaves, we have to bunch, we have to put into buckets, we have to transfer those buckets to our cooler. Oh, that was never mentioned. And then we have to bring empty buckets back. So there are a few investments here other than the time that it's going to take to harvest that many peonies that we also have to consider. All right, so I can just hinted at one, but let's talk about some of the expenses that probably were not mentioned in these viral reels or advertisements trying to get you to buy a class, thinking that flower farming is wildly profitable. We have our cooler. If you are trying to sell this many peony stems, 4,000 plants times 15 stems, 60,000 blooms, you are going to need a substantial walk-in cooler. Because here's the thing, you can't just cut those peonies and bring them inside. They're all going to open up. They have to be stored in a cooler. And a walk-in cooler is not cheap. All right, we've made one. It's basically a shed that's double insulated, very thick insulated walls. We have a cool bot running in there, but our cooler is only 8 by 8. And even then it costs around $10,000. So if we're looking at the size of a walk-in cooler that you're going to need to store 60,000 peony stems, you're looking at probably at least 20 grand and up to $30,000 for the cooler alone. And this is an ongoing maintenance cost as well, because you have to keep the air conditioning units updated, the power that's required to run that AC to keep those peonies chilled in the time between when you harvested and when you can sell them. There's also the upfront expense. So we talked about that you're probably not going to be making any money on peonies for the first 3 years, yet you have a fair amount of expenses to get started growing 4,000 peonies, and number one is the peony roots themselves. So we mentioned you can get them wholesale, you can get them retail, either one, but retail are going to be more expensive. So you have to already get your business started up, you have to have all of that ready to go so that you can order your roots wholesale. You need a sales tax ID and all this stuff to do that. So if you're ordering wholesale, you're looking at about $10 a root. If you're ordering retail, $40 a root. So $10 a root, 40,000 roots, you're looking at around $40,000 for that investment upfront just on the peony roots. The other thing you're going to need to think about is help with planting all 4,000 of those peonies. If you're going to be digging them by hand, you're looking at a world of hurt. So you probably will want to hire some machinery or some help. So there's going to be an expense there, either machinery rental or purchase of machinery for ongoing maintenance of your peony field. Either one of those, depending on, now that price could obviously range from a rental cost, which could be relatively low, but then you're having to do ongoing rentals every year to do maintenance on your peonies, like cutting them down in the fall, or you're going to buy a piece of machinery. Either way, you're looking at probably another $1,000, all the way up to $30,000 to $40,000, depending on what size of tractor you decide to get and what kind of implements you decide to get. Now, this particular course that I'm referring to also recommends landscape fabric. Y'all know how I feel about that. I don't have to go into it. But if you do that on an acre, that's probably going to run you another $4,000-ish and a ton of microplastics to your soil. But anyway, there's also going to be irrigation. If you're in a dry area, you're going to have to figure out how to water these, because while peonies are low maintenance, if you really are using them as an investment and you're wanting to make money off of them, you're going to have to irrigate. If you're in a dry climate like mine, we have to water our peonies at least once a week. So in that case, you're looking at irrigation tubing, figuring out how to get the water, paying for the water if you don't have a water source already. And then the biggest cost, which is going to be labor. And labor is always the cost that gets left out. And I included this when I went over my taxes and all of my profits from that last video. And I mentioned that here's what my per hour payment is, but we need to factor in labor into all of this, right? Labor to plant the peonies, labor to weed the peonies, labor to cut down the peonies, labor to harvest the peonies, and the biggest one, labor to sell those peonies. Where are you planning to sell 60,000 stems at retail price? $2 is closer for, say, wholesale. So usually growers who are growing a lot of one thing, like that many peonies, they sell wholesale because they can sell to a wholesaler in bulk. They can sell everything at once and they can get it out of there. Retail, we're looking at maybe $4 per stem. But to sell retail 60,000 stems of peonies is going to take a ton of marketing and a lot of organization. Whether you're shipping them out, you're going to need to staff people to ship, to package, to get those things out the door, or to bunch them and get them to customers. Dealing with retail is a lot more labor intensive than dealing with wholesale. To expect that we're going to be able to harvest all these peonies and sell them in the time that we should before they really start to lose their quality in the cooler, you're going to need to hire a staff. And good luck with that, because I'll tell you what, I am very lucky that I have a gal who helps me in the summertime and is okay with working just 3 months. But to find someone who is okay with working full time for just 1 month out of the year is going to be a challenge. And someone who's going to be reliable and trustworthy, it's going to be tough. All this to say, the other thing is that there is a fair amount of risk. When we're growing a monoculture crop, like we mentioned, all peonies, for example, we're taking on a much bigger risk. So at my farm, we grow over 80 varietals of different things. Some people say that's a bad business idea. I disagree, but some people will say just focus on 1 or 2 plants. That can be a good plan. Again, if you're planning to sell in bulk to a wholesaler, it can be a good way to go. But monocultures is one, and the other problem with that is the risk. So we have had all of the following things happen in the last 5 years of me growing peonies. 1, we've had 2 major hailstorms in June that wiped out our entire crop. We have had a late freeze that just as our peonies were budded and getting ready to go to marshmallow stage, they all died. So they were just mush on the stems. And we had a series of hot, windy days that were up into the 80s, almost 90s in May. And what happens with that, with peonies, is these hot, dry winds come along and all of a sudden, all your peonies blow open. And then you can't harvest. You can't sell a blown open peony. It's not good practice. It's going to fall apart on the customer's table. You won't have customers next year. So there is a lot of risk when you decide to put all of your eggs into one basket. And I say this because I had a consulting client and they were in their 70s and they had invested in a field of peonies as a retirement plan. And now that they were a year in, they were realizing this, that they can't harvest right away. It's going to be a 10-year before they get returns, and how much labor it was going to take them. Physically, they were not going to be able to do it once those peonies were mature, and they had put a pretty good chunk of their retirement savings into this plan, and they were pretty devastated. I don't want that to happen to anyone else. I think it's great that there are people who are selling courses on how to flower farm, how to grow flowers, especially if they're doing it in a good way that's environmentally conscious. But I think that there are other times when people are selling courses and the way that they're getting people to buy the courses is misleading at best and predatory at worst. So take these things with a grain of salt. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Making $240,000 working 1 month out of the year, or being a full-time farmer and being able to take the winters off. Oh, I mean, maybe. But again, you can go back and watch our video on how much our average income is. But I will say this. This year it was different. So this year I actually had a lower expense number because I didn't buy in any plants. Now that my farm is up and running, I have all my perennials going. Now that we're going into year 5, my expenses on plants have gone way down. And I grow all of my annuals from seed, and that is a big cost saver and something that a lot of flower farmers don't do. They buy in plugs, which can be very costly. Buying in plugs can run you anywhere from $50 to $85 per tray of flowers, and then you also have to pay for shipping, which is usually around $75 per box. So you're looking at a lot of money if you're planning on shipping in all of the flowers that you need from plugs. So if you want to make money flower farming, here are my tips. 1, learn to grow from seed and learn to do it economically. Soil blocking, right? Something where you're going to be able to just use one tray every year, year over year, and not buy new ones, and a soil blocker, and that's all you need. Instead of having to buy plastic things every year, that's going to really eat into your expenses. So find something that you can do that's economical, but learn how to start your own seeds. Don't buy in plugs if you can. This is also because we can control better what's in the plants, and we know that they haven't been treated with weird fungicides and pesticides, but that's a whole nother video. The other thing I'd recommend is have a plan in place for your marketing. Who are you selling to? And that is going to inform you what kind of flowers you are growing. If you want to learn more about this, I'm going to be running a marketing course in the next month for flower farmers who want to learn more about that piece of it. But it is important that you know who your market is so that you can plan your marketing around that. Don't go into it not knowing who you're planning to sell to. And the last tip I'm going to tell you is expect to work hard. If you go into this because you see an ad that is telling you that you can make this amount of money and take the entire winter off or only work for 1 month out of the year, if that's why you're going into it, you're going to be disappointed. And anytime that we go into it with a different expectation than what the reality is, we're going to be disappointed. We're probably not going to put in all the effort that we should. So know that it is a full-time job. And even in the wintertime, and even if you're just growing peonies, you're still looking at maintenance, you're looking at weeding, you're looking at upkeep on those flowers. You're looking at sales and marketing the rest of the year in order to push that many stems. So be realistic with yourselves. And I think that's it for my rant for today. Speaking of courses, one last thing I wanted to mention was that we actually just posted our flower arranging course. So if you've been watching our short videos about how we put our bouquets together, we did a more in-depth instructional video on how we make bouquets, corsages, and boutonnieres and centerpieces. So if you're growing cut flowers from our cut flower garden plans, any of those ones from last spring, then you can learn how to arrange them. So I'll put that course down below. In the meantime, if you guys have any questions that I didn't address in this video about making money flower farming, please let me know below. We appreciate your likes, your subscribes. Those mean the world to me here in the basement. And stay tuned because our next video I am filming tomorrow about which seed starting recipe won. All right, we did another trial for soil blocking and we have a clear winner. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you guys around here next time at the farm basement.